But, right. Where was I? Oh, ass biscuits. But,
The terrible dangers faced by prostitutes, even the more upmarket types, were made all too clear to early 19th century America after a woman was killed in a brothel by a regular client. The woman's name was Helen Jewett. Her murder, along with the following trial and her murderer's exoneration, drew groundbreaking public attention. It was the first time a sex crime of this sort was covered extensively in the American press. Born to a working-class family in Temple, Maine, Jewett's father was an alcoholic and her mother died when she was young. Helen, whose real name was Dorcas Doyen, decided to call herself Helen Jewett. She frequently changed names, a common practice at the time. Employed at the age of only 12 or 13 in the home of Chief Justice Nathan Weston of the Maine Supreme Judicial Court, Jewett spent the next 4 years working as a servant girl. As she grew older, she transformed into an assertive young woman and became conscious of her own beauty. As she approached her teens, Helen felt she could better herself by moving to New York City. This she did in 1831. After arriving in the big city, it was not very long at all before her great beauty was noticed by the denizens of the seedier parts of town. She was swiftly enticed to start employment in a bordello operated by a woman calling herself Rosina Townsend, who ran her house on Thomas Street in Lower Manhattan, which catered for the more discerning gentleman in search of female companionship. Helen was earning a very comfortable living as a high-class courtesan in only a short space of time. Richard Robinson was born in Connecticut in 1818 and apparently received a good education. He, like Helen, had also left his hometown as a teenager to live in New York City and found employment in a dry goods store in Lower Manhattan. In his late teens, Robinson began consorting with a rough crowd and took to using the name Frank Rivers as an alias when he would visit prostitutes. According to some accounts, at the age of 17, he happened to run into Helen Jewett as she was being accosted by a ruffian outside a Manhattan theater. Robinson beat up the thug, and Helen, impressed by the strapping teen, gave him her calling card. Robinson began visiting Jewett at the brothel where she worked. Thus began a complicated relationship between the two. Helen and Richard's relationship was a rocky one. This was evident to their mutual friends. According to various accounts, in early April 1836, Helen became convinced that Robinson was planning to marry another woman, and she began threatening him. It was also suggested that Robinson had been embezzling money to lavish on Helen, and that he had become worried that she would expose him. Rosina Townsend claimed that Robinson came to her house late on Saturday night, April the 9th, 1836, and visited Helen. In the early hours of the 10th, Miss Townsend awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of someone trying to get out of the front door, which she always kept locked from the inside. At first, she thought nothing of it and dozed back to sleep. Then she went upstairs to check on the women in her employ. When she reached Helen's room, she noticed smoke billowing out from under the door. "Fire!" she cried. "Fire! Fire!" Soon the whole house was awake, pouring into the hallways in various stages of undress. Someone quickly ran out and alerted the watchman stationed down the street. While awaiting the watchman to arrive, Rosina gained entry to Helen's room to alert her to the fire. It quickly became apparent to the madam that Helen would not be heeding her calls to rouse herself from bed. Helen lay motionless on the smouldering bed, her blood pooling onto the floorboards below. Her head had been struck 3 times with a sharp object, believed to have been a hatchet. Because there were no signs of a struggle, it must be assumed that Helen had not been expecting the vicious attack. This was deduced by the position of her lifeless body on the bed. To try and cover up the heinous crime, her murderer had also set fire to the bed. Police not long after arrived and questioned Rosina Townsend. She recounted the previous evening's events. She recalled Helen had asked her not to admit one of her Saturday night regulars. Another caller would visit her instead. When the man arrived, he covered his face with a cloak, but Rosina recognized him as one of Helen's regular clients, a man named Richard Robinson. Later on the morning of the murder, police went to Richard's lodgings and found him fast asleep and still fully dressed. They roughly awakened him and escorted him to the crime scene, a common practice of the time. Officers were amazed to note his composure and impassivity upon viewing his lover's charred and mutilated corpse. Robinson later told a neighbor, "Do you think I would blast my brilliant prospects by so ridiculous an act? I'm a young man of only 19 years of age yesterday, with most brilliant prospects." Police investigating believed it to be an open and shut case. They weren't looking for anyone else in connection to the crime, and so promptly arrested Robinson and charged him with murder. On June the 2nd, 1836, his court trial began. The newspapers went crazy over the story. The more weighty of the New York newspapers didn't pick up on the story at first, believing it not worthy of attention. But with little information, penny papers like The Sun, The Courier, and The Inquirer urged its readers to consider how an upstanding and legitimately employed young man like Robinson could possibly be mixed up with murder. They portrayed Helen as a prostitute, but well-read, her closet full of fine gowns, her reputation so very prominent in New York society. Soon it was discovered that facts mattered little, as long as there was the sordid sex side of the case to be gleefully described in papers hot off the press, a topic rarely open to discussion in polite society. This story was a big seller. Editor James Gordon Bennett of the New York Herald viewed the crime scene and reported back in ancient poetic fashion. Slowly I began to discover the lineaments of the corpse as one would the beauties of a statue of marble. Not a vein was to be seen. The body looked as white, as full, as polished as pure Parian marble. The perfect figure, the exquisite limbs, the fine face, the full arms, the beautiful bust, all surpassing in every respect the Venus de Medicis. In addition to playing up the sexual details and lacking other concrete facts, papers turned to blatant fabrication. It seems impossible a loop can be found whereupon to hang a doubt that the life of Miss Jewett was taken by any other hand than his, wrote the Sun. Others falsified evidence. Bennett of the Herald was accused of paying someone $50 to forge a letter purported to be from the real killer. It was printed, and within a week the paper was selling out, as the daily run was as big as 15,000 copies. The pre-murder levels were only between 1 and 2,000. The eyewitness and circumstantial evidence left little doubt of Robinson's guilt. Over 5 days, the all-white male jury heard testimony from Rosina Townsend and from Emma French, a prostitute witness who recalled Robinson arriving at the house at 9:30 p.m. the evening of the crime. Another man identified the hatchet as the one missing from his shop. Detectives found a string around the hatchet that matched a loop inside the cloak of Richard, presumably used to conceal the weapon.
Doopy doopy doo. Mark 2. That's the end of that.